Madrid, 04:17 a.m. The sky ripped apart as fireballs streaked overhead. Explosions rolled across the city, shaking towers and lighting the horizon like sunrise made of flame. Sirens screamed too late. People poured into the streets in disbelief. This was no terrorist strike, no isolated incident. Across Europe, from Athens to Lisbon, from Rome to Bucharest, the same nightmare unfolded. India had launched the unthinkable, a full-scale offensive against Europe. Hypersonic missiles, cyber attacks, and drone swarms struck the continent at once. The map of global power had just been torn apart. It began with silence. A silence on screens, in radars, and communication lines. At midnight European time, power grids across southern Europe flickered, bank servers crashed, air traffic control systems froze. Engineers thought it was a glitch. It wasn't. It was India's cyber command, unleashing a digital tidal wave that paralyzed infrastructure across half a dozen countries. And then the missiles came. From hidden silos deep in the Indian heartland, Agni Vihik's intercontinental ballistic missiles lifted into the sky, their warheads splitting into multiple re-entry vehicles. Hypersonic BrahMos-2 cruise missiles followed, hugging terrain, invisible to radar until the last second. In less than 15 minutes, the first impact struck. Madrid's financial district went dark as warheads smashed into power plants and telecom hubs. Rome's Campino airport erupted in fire as missiles cratered its runways, grounding military and civilian aircraft alike. Athens, Thessaloniki, Lisbon, and Sofia all felt the shock within the same hour. Europe's south was under siege before dawn. Drone swarms crossed the Mediterranean, hundreds of them launched from Indian carriers and forward-deployed ships. They targeted refineries, naval docks, and even city centers. Civilian footage filled social media, glowing trails of drones darting between buildings, explosions blooming where they hit. Hashtags like Europe burns and unthinkable war trended worldwide within minutes. The shock was absolute. For decades, Europe had prepared for threats from Russia, terrorism, or cyber warfare, but never an outright invasion from India. Diplomats scrambled for explanations. Indian state media announced that the strikes were defensive, a retaliation against Western interference in Asia. But the reality was plain. This was an expansionist campaign, an offensive designed to seize territory. Which territory? The answer became clear as the first amphibious landings began. From the eastern Mediterranean, Indian carrier strike groups advanced, their decks alive with MiG-29Ks and drone squadrons. Under the protection of long-range missile screens, they launched waves of landing craft toward Greece's coastline. Thessaloniki's port was their first objective, its docks critical for controlling supply lines into the Balkans. Greece, unprepared for such a direct assault, faltered. Its small navy clashed with Indian destroyers but was swept aside by hypersonic strikes. Coastal defenses fired sporadically, some hitting their targets, most overwhelmed by sheer numbers. By dawn, Indian Marines had stormed ashore, planting their flag on European soil. Elsewhere, Spain and Portugal reeled. Their air defenses, outdated and limited, struggled to intercept incoming salvos. Some missiles were shot down by Patriot batteries borrowed from NATO deployments, but many slipped through. Cities lay scarred, ports disabled, economies paralyzed within hours. And yet not all of Europe was helpless. France and Britain scrambled immediately. From Toulon, French Rafale lifted into the night, streaking east to intercept incoming bombers. From Gibraltar, Royal Navy destroyers fired volleys of interceptors, bringing down waves of drones before they could reach Madrid. But the truth was harsh. In those first hours, India's offensive had carved deep wounds into Europe's underbelly. Germany tried to mobilize, but its air defense network lagged. Poland raised its army and offered bases to NATO, but reinforcements were days away. Italy, pummeled by missile barrages, struggled to organize a counterstrike. Europe had not faced such coordinated destruction since the Second World War. The continent had been caught off guard, and India's message was clear. The age of distant wars was over. No capital was safe, no border untouchable. The war that no one thought possible had arrived, and it carried the tricolor of India across European skies. The first strike was complete. The invasion had begun. The sun rose over the Aegean, but its light revealed only smoke and ruin. Thessaloniki's port, once bustling with ferries and tankers, now burned under the shadow of Indian warships anchored offshore. Indian Marines spread through the docks, securing warehouses and rail lines that would funnel supplies deeper into the Balkans. Above them, MiG-29Ks and swarms of drones kept the skies under constant surveillance. Europe had been breached. Across Greece, panic spread faster than the flames. Civilians fled north toward the mountains, clogging roads as artillery thundered in the distance. The Greek government, overwhelmed by the sudden scale of the attack, appealed desperately to NATO. "We are under occupation," the Prime Minister declared. "Europe must respond." And respond it did. From Toulon, the French carrier Charles de Gaulle surged east, escorted by frigates and submarines. Rafale M fighters launched from its deck, streaking across the Mediterranean to challenge Indian air patrols. In London, British Typhoons scrambled, while destroyers left Portsmouth to reinforce Gibraltar. The alliance that many had called fractured was suddenly alive, its survival instincts jolted awake by the unthinkable sight of Indian troops planting their flag on European soil. Yet the escalation was brutal. Indian missile batteries mounted on Aegis-like destroyers fired salvos at incoming French aircraft. Hypersonic BrahMos 2 missiles screamed through the stratosphere, aimed at intercepting NATO fleets before they could close the distance. One French frigate, caught mid-transit, vanished in a ball of fire as its missile defenses failed to catch the incoming warhead. The Mediterranean, long thought a safe sea, was now an active battlefield. Meanwhile, in Spain and Portugal, the chaos deepened. Indian cyber attacks crippled banking systems, plunging economies into paralysis. Blackouts spread across Lisbon and Madrid, leaving millions in darkness. Ports remained closed, their cranes twisted wreckage from missile strikes. For the first time in modern history, Western Europe felt the sting of total war. Germany, too, reeled under pressure. Its economy hummed with production, but its military machine lagged behind. Luftwaffe fighters scrambled from scattered bases, but the patchwork of air defense systems left massive gaps. In Berlin, leaders urged caution, unwilling to provoke further strikes until NATO command issued a unified response. Poland and the Baltic states, by contrast, mobilized immediately, offering airfields for American and British reinforcements. They had lived under the shadow of Russia for decades. Now they braced for another giant pressing against Europe's doors. For India, the offensive was going according to plan. Its generals boasted that the Mediterranean is ours and promised more landings along the Adriatic. Convoys of landing craft ferried troops and armor onto Greek shores, pushing inland to secure Thessaly and the approaches to Macedonia. Propaganda broadcasts showed triumphant soldiers waving Indian flags over European fortresses, declaring the dawn of a new global order. But cracks already formed beneath the surface. NATO intelligence confirmed that India's logistics were strained. Its fleets had sailed far from home, dependent on extended supply lines vulnerable to submarine interdiction. Its missile barrages, though devastating, could not be infinite. And its forces on the ground, while victorious in Greece, were isolated deep inside hostile territory. The counterstroke began at sea. American carrier groups rushing across the Atlantic coordinated with French and British fleets. Submarines prowled the Mediterranean, striking at Indian supply convoys with torpedoes. Several landing ships erupted in flames before reaching the shore, their wreckage littering the Aegean like grim monuments to overreach. In the skies, French Rafales clashed with Indian MiGs in furious dogfights above Crete. Missiles traced spirals across the blue, drones buzzed between contrails, and the thunder of supersonic combat shook the islands. Pilots fought not just for survival but for the control of the Mediterranean skies, a battle that would determine whether India could hold its foothold or be thrown back into the sea. By nightfall, Europe burned on two fronts: the Balkans under the heel of Indian troops, and the Mediterranean alive with the fury of NATO's counterattack. The continent, shocked and bleeding, had awakened. The war was no longer one-sided. It was now a clash of civilizations, and its outcome would reshape the world. The escalation was complete. The invasion was no longer a question of how far India could go, but whether Europe could summon the strength to drive it back. The third week of the war dawned, with the Mediterranean transformed into a cauldron of fire. Once a sea of commerce and tourism, it now bristled with carriers, destroyers, submarines, and the wreckage of warships smoldering beneath the waves. The clash between India and NATO had reached its breaking point. At dawn, Indian carrier groups moved to expand their control. Amphibious task forces pressed deeper into the Adriatic, aiming to secure footholds in Albania and southern Italy. MiG-29Ks screamed overhead, supported by swarms of drones that scanned the skies for threats. Their commanders envisioned a chain of occupied ports stretching from Greece to the Tyrrhenian Sea, a gateway into Europe's heart. But NATO was ready. American carrier strike groups, having crossed the Atlantic, now surged into the Mediterranean. USS Gerald R. Ford and USS Harry S. Truman led the charge, their decks teeming with F-35s and Super Hornets. French Rafales lifted from the Charles de Gaulle, while British F-35Bs thundered off HMS Queen Elizabeth. Together, they formed a wall of steel and firepower unmatched since the Second World War. The battle began with a storm of missiles. Indian BrahMos 2 hypersonics streaked toward the NATO fleet, their speeds bending radars to their limits. Aegis destroyers launched interceptors in desperate waves, the sky filling with blossoms of light as missiles collided midair. Some slipped through. One U.S. destroyer vanished in a fireball, another crippled and burning. Yet the fleet survived, pushing onward into the contested sea. Above, the skies turned into a slaughterhouse. F-30 thieves prowled unseen, ambushing Indian MiGs and drones with precision-guided missiles. Rafales danced in deadly dogfights, weaving through contrails as flares streaked across the dawn. The noise of supersonic combat shook islands for miles, as entire squadrons clashed in battles that stretched from Crete to Sicily. Beneath the waves, NATO's submarines struck hard. Virginia-class hunters sank Indian supply ships one after another, severing the arteries that kept the invasion alive. Convoys carrying fuel and ammunition erupted in fireballs, their flames rising against the night sky. For Indian Marines stranded in Greece, the realization was grim. The promised reinforcements would not come. The turning point arrived in the afternoon. A swarm of NATO aircraft, coordinated through AWACS and satellite feeds, struck directly at India's carriers. The INS Vikrant, pride of the Indian Navy, came under relentless assault. First came the electronic jamming, blinding its radars. Then the torpedoes from submarines prowling below. Finally, waves of cruise missiles rained down. Explosions ripped across its deck, tearing through aircraft and fuel stores. By sunset, smoke poured from its hull, listing heavily as its escorts scrambled to save it. The symbol of India's naval power was crippled. On land, the resistance hardened. South of Thessaloniki, French paratroopers dropped into embattled positions, linking up with retreating Greek forces. British commandos cut supply lines in the Balkans, ambushing convoys that snaked through mountain passes. Local militias joined them, civilians taking up arms to resist occupation. Every kilometer India had taken now became a battlefield to hold. Meanwhile, propaganda battles raged as fiercely as the combat itself. Indian media claimed victories, boasting of new territories secured. But leaked footage told another story: burning carriers, stranded divisions, and cities in revolt. Across Europe, crowds rallied behind their governments, demanding that India be expelled at any cost. NATO's unity, once fragile, had become iron. By nightfall, the Mediterranean was a hellscape of burning ships and falling aircraft. Yet the tide was clear. NATO's technological edge, combined with the sheer weight of American reinforcements, had broken India's momentum. The once bold invasion now teetered on collapse. Inside Indian command bunkers, silence fell. Generals stared at maps littered with red X's marking destroyed fleets and lost divisions. The dream of a European foothold was crumbling. The question was no longer whether they could expand, it was whether they could escape annihilation. The culmination had come. Europe's darkest hours were giving way to the first glimmers of reversal. The Indian offensive, once a shock that shattered the continent, now stood on the edge of defeat. The fourth month of war opened with Europe transformed into a battlefield of liberation. Where once Indian Marines had marched through Thessaloniki's port, Now French and British flags flew again, supported by NATO armor and the cheers of civilians who had survived weeks of terror. The invasion that had begun with fire from the skies was ending in fire from the seas. Only now it was India's fleets that burned. In the Aegean, the wreck of INS Vikrant still smoldered, its twisted hull a monument to India's failed gamble. Submarines prowled the depths, striking down any remaining convoys. American B-2 bombers swept overhead, delivering precision strikes on retreating divisions. The supply lines that once promised to carry the Indian Army into Europe were gone, cut by relentless NATO interdiction. Thousands of Indian troops were now stranded, encircled in hostile territory, their commanders silent as communications collapsed. On the ground, the counteroffensive roared. Greek, French, and British forces, bolstered by American armor, flown into European ports, surged north. Every village retaken became a symbol. Every town liberated another nail in the coffin of India's grand design. In the mountains of Macedonia, Indian mechanized brigades tried to hold their lines, but they faced the combined weight of NATO artillery, drones, and airstrikes. Precision fire shattered bunkers. Columns of armor erupted into flame. Survivors fled into the hills, abandoning equipment that had once been paraded as proof of India's rising power. Meanwhile, across Europe, unity hardened. Germany, initially hesitant, now unleashed its industrial machine, sending waves of Leopard tanks and Marder IFVs into the front. Poland and the Baltic states offered not just bases but troops, eager to repay debts of security by defending the continent. Even neutral nations broke silence, declaring support for the alliance. What India had imagined as a fractured Europe had instead become a fortress armed with the most advanced militaries on Earth. In New Delhi, the tone shifted from triumph to desperation. State media no longer boasted of victories, instead it pleaded for restraint, accusing NATO of colonial aggression. But the images could not be denied. Carriers sunk, divisions destroyed, soldiers captured on European soil. The myth of unstoppable expansion crumbled in real time, broadcast to a world that now questioned whether India's gamble would cost it more than defeat abroad. The final blow came in the Adriatic. As Indian forces attempted one last evacuation, NATO fleets struck without mercy. Cruise missiles tore into landing ships. Torpedoes ripped apart escorts. What remained of India's expeditionary force was swallowed by the sea. Survivors were taken prisoner, their invasion reduced from bold conquest to shattered retreat. By the war's end, less than a third of the invading army made it home. Europe erupted in relief. Cities scarred by missile fire lit candles for the dead, but they also celebrated survival. In Athens, crowds filled Syntagma Square, chanting in defiance, "We are free!" In Rome, bells rang across the Vatican as smoke still rose from craters nearby. In Madrid, families returned to darkened homes, promising to rebuild. The war had cost thousands of lives and billions in damage, but Europe had endured. And the world? It shifted overnight. NATO, once mocked as fractured and outdated, stood renewed as the most formidable alliance on Earth. France and Britain emerged as Europe's twin military pillars, their navies and air forces bloodied but proven. The United States reaffirmed its role as the ultimate guarantor, its carriers and bombers the decisive weight in the battle. Japan and Australia, watching closely, strengthened their own packs, determined to resist any similar threats in the Indo-Pacific. For India, the consequences were catastrophic. Its fleets decimated, its credibility shattered, its leaders humiliated. The dream of projecting power into Europe had collapsed in flames. What was meant to be a show of dominance became a cautionary tale. Overreach can destroy even the most ambitious rising power. The resolution of the conflict was clear. Europe still stood. NATO still ruled the seas. And India's gamble would be remembered not as the dawn of a new empire, but as the night its ambitions drowned in the Mediterranean. Disclaimer. This video is a fictional simulation. It does not depict real events. It imagines how such a conflict could unfold and what consequences it could bring for Europe and the world.